have to say, it is a little bit difficult to close a series on Genesis and tie that into Christmas, but I felt like both had to be done. So if at some point in this I don't get where we're supposed to get, you'll have to forgive me. And we'll all pretend like it was great, okay? Here's where we've been. We've been enjoying the story of Abraham and his family. And what's fascinating about Abraham is that in the midst of difficult struggles, in the midst of a difficult world and a difficult place to live, Abraham is focused on a God who intends to do something different with people, something different with the world, something different that they serve in terms of their purpose, in terms of who they are. This morning I want us to look, because this story, in a lot of ways, this family gets a lot of things right. They understand the world differently. They live out their faith differently. They show us what religion is supposed to be and not what the harm that it can do. But in a lot of other ways, they make a lot of mistakes along the way. I think we can resonate with that in terms of where we've been and where we come from and the mistakes that we're going to make. So we have to kind of recognize the both and of this family. And along the way, we learn some pretty great insights about God and about living God's love. This morning, I want to focus on this final story, which is Joseph in Egypt. And there is a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and a lot of hurt that goes into this story. And not what you'd expect to come out of it, which is more pain and more suffering, escalated violence, all the normal sort of human condition. It is human for us to return violence for violence. It is human for us to seek revenge. It is human for us to desire to level the playing field and to make sure somebody knows what they've done. Sometimes I find that I'm able to do that, and sometimes I don't. And as the season goes, we were pulling into a parking spot on, I think it was Wednesday, and this nice old gentleman and his family, I'm not kidding, around the parking lot and zoomed into that spot, knowing that we were waiting on it. I start to roll down my window. Fortunately for Jenna, it was locked because of the kids. I don't think it was locked because of me. And it didn't roll down. So we went on our way and parked. And we were walking up to the door. And we got there at the same time. And I was like, Jenna, it's perfect timing. And she says, don't say anything. And so this caps it off. They push the handicap button on the door because one of the people with them is in a wheelchair, and it's not working. So we were already maneuvering around the mall doors into the second set of doors, and literally reaching for the door when that button doesn't work, and he jumps in front of me and opens the door for them. And I was like, really? Like, how does that happen twice in the same... And Jenna, again, pulled me away. We have a tendency to make sure somebody knows. And I didn't want to do anything harmful. I just wanted to let him know what he had done, right? You should know. You should know that that's not okay. Sometimes that's not the right thing to do either. We have a tendency to return that negativity with more negativity. We have a tendency not just to return it, but to escalate it or to return it with a little more force, right? We have a tendency to fail in a lot of situations when when forgiveness is the better option, the godly option, the appropriate option, and instead we choose greater conflict again and again and again. And it's one of those things, I think, that is deeply tied to pride. I'm never wrong about anything, but you might be, and you might find it hard to admit that you're wrong from time to time. There's a political analyst, he does sports stuff, his name's Nate Silver, and he crunches numbers. That's what he does well. And I love reading his stuff because he's very sort of open about the number crunching process and running polls and digging into the numbers and all of that. And they can be read different ways. And when he predicts, he is often very successful at predicting elections and things like that. But he often will tell you, here's what my numbers say, and he'll add a percentage to that, 70% or something like that. And he explained this in an article I read once. He said, basically, my algorithms spit out, an election, a person that should win the election. And basically that number is 70% of the time my algorithms are going to spit out this answer. But sometimes they're not. And it goes like this. He says, we all think that we are right on everything in particular. And yet we know that we can't be right on everything. So it's those 30% numbers and sometimes higher where you go, well, which are the things that I'm not right on? Because on each of those items, I've determined that I'm right. I think through all of this and decide that I'm not right on each item. And so I have a hard time letting go when I'm not right. It's the same situation as this guy jumping in front of me and me saying, well, I think he needs to know what he's done, right? It's about pride. It's about our tendency to have things right. It's about our desire to be the one that is correct in a situation. Now, here's what it does. It leads us into more negative space. It leads us into more pain and suffering. It leads us to quite literally hate the world or hate the season or hate what's around us or hate people. We've all been in that space. Who likes to go shopping this week? We know better, right? Why do we know better? Because we know we're going to run into people, and those people are going to tell us that people are bad when they do bad things, and we're going to internalize that, and it's going to spin it around. We watch this in situations time and time again. But in this family of Abraham, what we see is time and time again, somebody that steps up and says, no, we're not going to live by this rule of negativity or this rule of escalated violence or this rule where we take care of our own and push everyone else away. We're going to live, and this is the rule that Abraham started with. We're going to live to bless those around us. So this morning, as we finish the story of Joseph, keep that in mind, as he has every right in the world to take that negative and the anger and the revenge and run with it. And you can see him toy with it in the story, yet in the end, he lets it all go. So last week we left off with Joseph. Let's see here. Last week we left off with Joseph and his brothers hated him because he told them his dreams about all of them bowing down to him. His brothers hated him because his dad cared for him more than them. His brothers hated him maybe because he was the young one and also full of haughtiness or something like that. But in the end, they throw him into a pit, and he gets sold into slavery into Egypt. And his life story is told on the stage of Egypt. We have someone who has been through almost as bad as it gets, the worst kind of situation that you can be in. And how he returns that is following God and choosing to live day by day, trusting that God is going to care for him. So he first ends up in the hands of Potiphar. Potiphar sees that he cares about God. He sees that he's honest. He puts him in charge of his entire household. Potiphar's wife one day attempts to seduce him. He says no. She tells Potiphar that he did this anyway. Potiphar sends him to prison. He spends years in prison. Again, they see his honesty. They see his value. They see his connection to God. They see his willingness to serve in any and every situation. And so the prison guard puts him in charge of an entire block of prisoners and says, "You're in charge of these people." So he is, again, caring for people at every step of the way. Even in the midst of all of this trouble, all of this pain, all of this suffering, Joseph continues to care for people. Maybe he's special. Maybe he was just raised differently. But the reality is, he's living a life that I couldn't. And I think many of you couldn't be in that situation, in that place, and follow God that faithfully. I think that's something to think about. Not to shame ourselves, but to think about the kind of pain and suffering that someone can endure and still maintain their care and love for those around them. It's not long before that caring and that lovingness and that connection to God moves him out of prison and into the hands of the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh needs a dream interpreted, and Joseph has been known to do that. Let's see. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. He fell asleep and dreamed a second dream very similar. And the chief cupbearer remembered Joseph interpreting his dream. And he says, "Pharaoh, there was once this person, a Hebrew." They don't like Hebrews. There was once this person, a Hebrew, and he was down in the prison. He's in charge of this block, and he can interpret your dream. And so Joseph comes up, Pharaoh sends for him, and Joseph interprets the dream and tells them, "Now here's exactly what you need to do." The dream is about the next 7 years, next 14 years. For 7 years, we're going to have huge amounts of, our crops are going to flourish, everything is going to go well. And then the next 7 years, there will be famine. And if you prepare for the 7 years now, you will be prepared for the next 7 years when all of the land is going to be in a drought. In that statement, we begin to see God's desire for this family to bless the entire world come to fruition. Because of Joseph, Egypt will be prepared for drought. Egypt will be prepared for famine. Egypt will be prepared when there is nothing in the land. They will be prepared. And so Pharaoh puts him in charge of everything. Now, I'm a little uncomfortable because they actually sell that grain, so they store it all up, and then they sell it to the Egyptians, and then they sell it to everyone else, and so they're like, we don't get the numbers, but I think they're quite wealthy by the end of this. Well, what happens in this moment is is that Jacob's brothers are in this land with famine. And they hear that Egypt has done this. They hear that Egypt has prepared and that there is plenty of food. So they go and they attempt to purchase food. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin, which is Joseph of Rachel, Benjamin of Rachel. Thus the sons of Israel were among the other people who came to buy grain, for the famine had reached the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was the governor of the land. It was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Remember that dream? When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. That's how I felt in that moment. Let me just tell you why it's not okay to park here. So he spoke harshly to them. He says, where do you come from? Well, we come from the land of Canaan to buy food. He said, you are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. And they said, no, my lord, your servants come to buy food. And they go in this back and forth. And so he brings them in and he questions them, puts them under pressure. He sends them back with grain, but keeps one until they bring their brother Benjamin back because he wants to see his brother. In all of this, he doesn't tell them who he is. I'm pretty sure that's how I would play that game. In all of this, he doesn't tell them who he is. In all of this, he is playing sort of a cruel joke on them. But in an effort to bring them to a place so that he can bless them, he sends them back with all their money. He sends them back with their grain. And they come again, and he feeds them, and he sends them back again with grain. And eventually, he gets to this point. And what we would expect, and this is interesting because they actually have a conversation with themselves when they're standing before Joseph. The brothers have a conversation with themselves that say, this is because we sold our brother Joseph into slavery. That's why we're having these problems now. So this guilt followed them for years and years. And Joseph, of course, because he is actually Hebrew and was their brothers, understood what they were saying in their language, yet they didn't recognize him. Joseph had every right to truly return evil for evil. He had all the power. He could imprison them. He could have them killed. He could send them home with nothing, which was essentially a death sentence. He could keep them. He could have sent them home, bring back Benjamin, and kept Benjamin. He could have done anything he wished to do. And in the end, he chose forgiveness. In the end, he wept before his brothers. He wept so loud that they could hear him throughout the courts. Joseph came from a different family. Esau came from a different family. And when Jacob returned, Esau wept on his brother's shoulders. Joseph did the same. And what would be expected is vengeance. What would be expected is escalated violence. What would be expected is to treat them harshly and to maintain that. Yet Joseph follows a different God. A God that is there to bless all of the people. A God that is relentless in love. The word that gets used is chesed. It is steadfast love. It is unending love. No matter what you do or where you've been or who you are, God continues to love. And Joseph shows the attitude of love. This week there was a song released. Well, let me back up. A year ago, the Taliban entered a school in Pakistan, killed 140 people. 130 of those people were children. This week marks the anniversary of that story, of that event. And the second song they released, this is the second song they released, the Pakistan public school released a song that essentially is titled, I will seek revenge from my enemy by educating my enemy's children. With all the pain in that moment and all the suffering that comes with the death of children, the response is, we will educate our enemy's children. We will end the escalation of violence. This is maybe the purest representation of God's love I've seen in a while. And it comes in the form of a Pakistani public school responding to the death of their classmates, to the death of their brothers and sisters. And the response is, enough is enough. Love, education, these are the answers, not more violence. Joseph is in line with this story, in line with the love of God, in line with everything that Abraham's call and his family's purpose is to bless those around him. And so not only is he blessing Egypt and all of the lands around them, he is returning love for violence. He is returning forgiveness for suffering. And he doesn't have to. This is ultimately God's response to humanity. What's amazing about this story is that again and again and again we see God's story reflecting, naturally, God's image, God's love, God's purpose, which is to respond to humanity with nothing but love and forgiveness. So in the ultimate act of love, in the midst of continued failure by people, we talked about my failures. We didn't get into yours. You can do that on your own. But in the continued face of failure and returning love with violence or negativity or frustration, God responds with love. And in this moment, in this season, what is so striking is that God's story hasn't changed. We look through these 5 stories of families, and we see them returning violence with love, or love for violence, or whatever. And God ultimately is doing the same thing. And so in the midst of failure, over and over and over, in the midst of torturing one's own people, in the midst of offering violence and abuse over people, over lands, over everything, God says, in the moment of Jesus, in the moment of the birth of Jesus, God says, still, I'm going to offer my son, send him to be part of humanity, to be with humanity, to continue to show my love to the world around it. There's the transition. Were you ready for it? This is the season. This is why we do this. This is why Christmas matters. It's not about the day or the Santa or the presents or the time of year. It matters because God said in that moment that all your failings, all your hate, and all your anger is going to be swept up because I am still with you. And no matter what you've done, God still loves us. And Jesus enters the scene, as Jenna read earlier, as Emmanuel, as God with us. That's a significant story. And it's the same story told in Genesis. It's the same story we tell today when we talk about our personal lives and how God moved us and changed us and brought us to the place we are. It is the same story that occurred when God said, I can't help but create. I have to love. It is that story over and over and over again, seeing God moved, not by our worship, not by our undying love for him, but by our failure, by our anger, by our brokenness. And at the end of all of that, God offers forgiveness. God offers his Son with us. And today we still talk about God with us in our presence, wherever two or more are gathered. God is with us. We take communion every week because as a family, God is with us. That's the story of this season. And it's the same story that Joseph is telling when he is willing to forgive his brothers for literally selling him into slavery.